Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a video for you about this little guy right here. This is the Sandrin Knives Carbon Fiber Torino. First off though, actually, before I go any further, I want to let you know Sandrin Knives sent this guy my way. They reached out to me after my review of the Torino, the original Torino, that is, this little guy, and said, hey Nick, we know that, that you were interested in maybe a different handle version of the Torino. Would you be interested in checking one out? I said, yes, absolutely, 100%. But I told him, as always, I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, the ugly. Might be a gem, might be junk. They did send it along. And in fact, I had this guy in my pocket a little while before the public review, so I actually have gotten a chance to put some mileage on this guy and carry it for a little while. And so there we go. But we do have to assume this is the best quality controlled one of these guys ever, and I'm doing my best not to let this affect the nature or the quality of my review. Next thing, let's go on ahead and talk about the what I'm doing here. This is going to be a comparison. This is going to be a follow-up, effectively. I'm not going to go back through and belabor every single point about the original Torino, because in a lot of ways, this is just the Torino wearing a different set of pants. They've made no other functional changes to it, aside from the difference of the scales here. And so I'm just going to kind of discuss it in that context. I'm going to talk about what's improved and what feels like a step down and give my final conclusion, but that's kind of where I'm going with this guy. So if you're curious about the model overall, make sure and check out the original review. Then finally, one thing that is very much worth noting is that this guy here, the original Torino here in the plastic and whatnot, well, actually, it doesn't. It's not plastic, but it sure feels like it. Was $199. This second guy in carbon fiber is at $299. So there is a $100 price hike going from this guy up here to this guy down here. Visually, yeah, it makes sense, but let's go on ahead and figure out, well, that actually works out in practice, and talk about what's good about this guy, what's not so good. So on the good side, to start with, it does have a lot of really good stuff there, right? The Torino is an interesting knife because it has some great stuff. It has good ergonomics in the hand, right? It's still it's a very lightweight knife here. I'll go ahead, I'll throw this guy on the scale here. What we're going to see here is we're coming in here at 2.28 ounces for the blade that is going to measure in just under 3 inches. So this is a very, very lightweight knife. And even relative to the original one, it's almost exactly the same weight. And so it's still a very lightweight knife. It's still very ambidextrous, with an ambidextrous thumb stud, an ambidextrous recoil locking mechanism in the back here, and a clip that you can go to either side. A lefty will have exactly the same experience as a righty with this pocket knife. It still has that nice locking mechanism here, which works quite well, and then, it can be disengaged quite well as well. It still has a very solid and utilitarian sort of feeling, particularly in the blade department, and it is still a very good knife for utility cutting, given just how thin the blade stock is and how good this polyhedral tungsten carbide is. And it has actually still a very nice crowned blade, which I didn't actually mention, I don't think, in the original review. But what you'll see here is that this is not just a flat surface along the top here. This is rounded off. Maybe by the finishing process, well, whatever that may be, or maybe just that was an explicit step they took, but this is a rounded off back of the blade, which is nice in the pocket. And then, of course, the nicest thing about any of the Sandrin knives, whether it's this guy, the Delatore is one of my favorites of them, is the blade here. This polyhedral tungsten carbide is great. It is a material that is just freaky in the amount of time it will cut before requiring sharpening. To the extent that I have a knife downstairs that I have decided is my box opening knife, from Sandrin, and I have used it and used it and used it as much as I possibly can, and you know what? Still haven't dulled the damn thing. So this is a very, very impressive blade. And with this kind of cutting geometry, with this thin, oh, it's just great. And so it still has a lot of the great stuff of the Torino. But the thing that's good about this, the thing that's best about this, is it is way more attractive by my measure. I understand 100% that for a lot of people, this aesthetic actually did land well. I was a little surprised, actually, at how many people are in love with the original aesthetic on the knife. But for me, coming from a more conventional knife world, this felt a lot more at home to me than this guy does. And if we put the blade aside here, I feel like this is an order of magnitude more attractive to my particular taste. Also worth noting is that the red backspacer here, as opposed to the gray there, which will echo what they've done in previous models like the Delatore here. I'm just a big fan of the aesthetics on this. This is just a very, very, well, okay, this is a much more attractive knife than the Torino, original Torino was, and I think for a lot of people that's going to make a lot of difference. And so to me, that's what's good here, is that it's way more attractive while still being a Torino, which is a very nice thing to be. On the bad side, it still does have some of the downsides. this very, very low grind is, well, it makes a lot of sense given how thin the blade stock is. But it's not the most attractive thing ever. It shows off large amounts of this finish on the side here, and that may not be a good thing depending on your take on the finish. There is still a lot of blade, a lot of handle for the amount of sharpened blade you're getting, because although I measured the blade at about 3 inches, in terms of sharpened length, we are coming in under 2.5 inches, so closer to 2.25. But nonetheless, it is not a particularly long blade in there. It's still going to be a little tricky to sharpen, requiring you to either use their service, which they do offer, or to use diamonds. You can do it at home. It just takes a good while. It is still an unrounded lock bar edge. I got to say, carrying this guy more, I had this guy in my pocket for a large part of a recent trip, and I kind of get it. This makes a lot of sense with a fingernail there. But if you're trying to do this with your thumb, I absolutely would have wanted this little edge kind of rounded off a little bit more. And it still does feel like a step down in terms of finishing, particularly in the blade from their prior work. This is the Sandrin Knives Della Torre here. And, this doesn't still feel as classy as the Della Torre does. And so that's still a thing. In practice, this is a cosmetic upgrade only for the scales. They've not made any functional changes. And a couple of those things I might like to have seen done a little different. One other thing that two other things that I did notice this time that weren't either that weren't an issue in the prior one or that I didn't notice then were the super thin washers on the inside of this. As you saw in the disassembly, those washers are tiny, tiny, tiny thin. And as a result, this is going to be a little bit more vulnerable to cupping and dishing. And if you over tighten the pivot, you could have a very bad time very easily. So I kind of hope that they do address that in future versions, because that's been a problem for other knives, not from them, but from other makers in the past. It's working fine at the moment, but at the same time, it's a thing. The other thing that I did notice here is that although in actual practice, like holding it in the hand, it is rock solid, there is no horizontal play, but if you really kind of work on it, there is a kind of strange vertical play here, and I don't know exactly, it's not affected really by putting the lock in there differently. It's weird. It's not particularly scary to me. Like a lot of vertical blade play feels really janky, but I think it's just this very different lock. The recoil lock has a slight, change there. And as a result, there is what feels like a little bit of vertical play if you're really working on it. I say that not because I think it matters, but I say that because it's something that you can kind of keep in mind, right? If you are a person who is an absolute snob about ultra solid, feels like a continuous piece of metal, this doesn't do that, but it is still very solid. And so I don't know quite what to make of it. I'd be curious to see more instantiations of this lock to see if other people are doing it differently. But in practice, both this guy and the original have it. You just really need to kind of work it to start to feel it. Like I said, I always feel weird mentioning things like that, but it's probably better to have it out there and say, I don't think this is a problem, but it could be if that really bothers you. And then finally, on the bad side, the thing that they didn't fix that is most disappointing to me is the blade finish on this. This still retains the original blade finish of the original Torino, which basically looks like they got the shop floor really sandy and just set the tungsten carbide down on there for a little while, a couple of months, and then just threw it right in the knife afterwards. They, practically speaking, did not apply a finish to this blade. This looks like a completely unfinished material. And although you can see that there are some, scratch patterns here, it's not uniform. You get these single pieces of scratch that go all across it, right? And so as a result, the knife looks very beat up coming out of the box day one. And so for me at least, it feels wildly out of place. This is a beautiful handle, fitting a beautiful knife, and then they did this to it. And that was the biggest thing that surprised me when I got this guy out of the box. From Sandrin is I thought for sure that when they did this, they would also do this. But no, it's the same blade, just a different handle. And so, to me, it still has that finish, and that just, or lack thereof, and that just doesn't do it for me. So to me, all that's the bad is that it still has the blade finish. It's got that little tiny bit of play. The super thin washers are a little weird, and then it still has some of the downsides of the original, like the low grind, etc., the unrounded lock bar edge. But a lot of those things, honestly, I can live with, and it's still a very good functional piece. And ultimately, my final conclusion is that this is still a very good functional piece. In a lot of ways, the original Torino was as well. This is a great working knife. As has been a lot of their stuff. I have a lot of respect for Sandrin, just in that the blade material is fundamentally different, and they're doing a lot of things that feel very different, and I can appreciate that. And so I think this is going to be a hit for them. The Torino original was a very, in a lot of ways, it was a good knife with a very polarizing design, particularly for the price point. This is a knife that looked a lot cheaper than it actually felt and than it functioned, if that makes sense, right? This looks, well, at least to my aesthetic, this feels like something you buy at a hardware store for $20, but in reality, it functions a lot better than that. Turns out a lot of folks like that approach, and you know what? That's great. I'm very happy to acknowledge different grinds for different kinds, right? It's a thing, but I know a lot of folks really didn't. And so what this does is it gives those folks a new option with new scales, and it puts it into an aesthetic that is tried and true in the knife world. Actual contoured carbon fiber that is well done. This is good carbon fiber. Is great. That's a great thing. And it's going to appeal to a whole bunch of people there. There are some issues still, of course, with a few of the downsides persisting, the thin washes, bit of play, the blade finish, and weird play, by the way. And then the $100 price hike. But in practice, I think what this is going to do is put some people on board with the Torino model who wouldn't have considered version 1, just aesthetically speaking, for whom this just didn't work. The biggest issue here for me remains the price to the finishing ratio, but I'm going to admit some bias here. I really, really dislike this blade finish. To me, this feels like they have cut a corner. And in a lot of ways, it felt more reasonable on this original knife where it was like, well, they cut 2 corners, right? They were really trying hard, it felt like, to make this guy seem less expensive and to save every dollar. But when you go up to something that's $100 more, keeping that finish is really rough. I kind of wish, and look, I get it. I completely understand that it's very difficult to polish something that is this damn hard. I understand that. I hear it, apologists, but it's a $300 pocket knife at this point. $300 is a little too much money to leave something that fundamental completely and totally unaddressed. I'm paying them a lot of money to do difficult things well here, and I just wish they'd made some kind of an effort, right? Even had they done something where they really tried hard to get the scratch pattern uniform in exactly one direction, then it would feel more like a satin finish, as opposed to when they've got this kind of, and there is a little bit of an overall directionality, but then they've got these random bits here that look like you've been cutting through freaking barbed wire all weekend, right? And so, as a result, it feels like they skipped a step. They didn't make that effort. And I think the number of people who wanted a knife that was upgraded to higher-end aesthetics was very large, but the number of people who wanted the upgrade only on this half may not be as large as you think. This feels like a missed opportunity to make something that is actually really high-end rather than something that's nicer but still has the shop floor finish right here. And honestly, I feel like this would have been much more interesting if they'd gone a little higher in the price at $325, but did this nice reflective blade finish from the Della Torre. Hey, is that a Nick Shabazz t-shirt? Sure is. NickShabazz.com/merch. Anyways, I digress, but I feel like they could have done a really nice job, if they'd kind of put this blade finish into this handle, and that would have been something that was really cool, and that would have really tickled some high-end collectors, and very easily could have earned that $300 price point, or maybe even one a little bit higher. But in practice, now they're asking me $300 for this finish, and that, to me, that's really rough, right? It feels like they kind of did half the work here, and I appreciate that half a lot. It's great, but I'm kind of hoping that they finish the job at some point. I hope that they eventually do release a model for the folks who want the handle and the blade to look really nice, kind of completing the trifecta, right? Where you can have the cheap handle and the cheap blade, you can have the nice handle and the cheap blade, and you can have the nice handle and the nice blade. I understand that there are people who really appreciate this blade finish, and you know what? That's great. Rock on, shine on, you crazy diamonds. But at least for me, that's a feeling, right? So a lot of folks are asking me, Nick, what do you think now that you got the Della Torre, which is about $300, but it is a slip joint. It is a fundamentally different knife. I love the Della Torre. I think it's an absolutely wonderful knife. There's a lot to love here. But now you've got this guy. You've got the mid-range. You've got the higher-end Torino, which I kind of hope eventually turns into the mid-range version with the in between, the nice finish and whatnot. But anyways, I have no evidence. I have no reason to believe that. I just kind of hope, right? But everyone's asking, where should you go? The answer between these two guys, pretending that nothing else will ever occur for the Torino lineup, that we're never going to get a high-end finish, the question is entirely aesthetic. If you like this original aesthetic, then do it. And frankly, I think there's a lot of argument to be made for it because this blade finish and this handle go together a lot better than this blade finish and this handle do. This feels more cohesive in a lot of ways, and this doesn't as much. So if you like this finish, then by God, do it, right? Save the cash, toss it in the toolbox, never sharpen it again, use it to death because it's a good, solid tool. But if you love the carbon fiber and you don't mind this blade finish, then by God, you can do this too, right? This is a really nice knife. It'll make a very solid user because, again, there is absolutely nothing you can do to this blade that's going to make it look worse for the wear. It's kind of as bad as it needs to get from the factory. And so that can be really nice if you're really planning to use this as a user-style knife. But if you're looking for a really high-end Torino, if that was what you were kind of looking for, like, oh, great, so they're going to do this, but they're going to do it, then honestly, I don't know that they've done that yet, right? I would hang out a little bit longer. And I would hope, and again, I have no information, but I would hope that someday they will launch a Grand Torino effectively that has the nice blade finish, the nice handle, probably a higher price, but I think for a lot of folks, that's probably going to end up being the sweet spot. They pair this handle with a blade where they really tried, oh man, that would be great, even if the price is going to be higher still. So ultimately, this is going to scratch an itch for a lot of people. This is going to be a cheaper way to scratch a very functionally identical itch, and I kind of hope that there's going to be one more version beyond this that really takes it up to the next level and really makes this as high-end feeling as some of Sandrin's other work has been. So overall, I mean, good job, Sandrin, in that you've made yet another really good functional tool, but there's a gap here. Please fill it. Anyways, there you go. Hope this has been interesting to you. And if you love the finish, then ignore everything I said and buy your heart, right? Then that's a beautiful thing. But I'm kind of a one-issue voter on this. So anyways, there you go. Hope this has been interesting to you. Have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.